Catherine Delahunty.
Mr Chair, tēnā koe. The estimates education debate is a little bit depressing. It's a little bit like Alice has fallen down the rabbit hole and ended up in a parallel universe, because I sincerely believe that all of us care about education and see its value in this House. I don't think there's anyone that doesn't. That is not the problem. The problem is, are we going to have an evidence-based policy, or are we going to have an ideology-based policy? And it's clear from the estimates priority setting that despite the rhetoric that all children must have access to high-quality education, there is actually a narrow focus in the national government's policies. A narrow focus around assessment and around failed examples of charter schools which lack evidence. I read today some of the PISA Volume 4, the OECD PISA Volume 4 report. It makes some very interesting points around what PISA now believes is that choice and competition have failed to lift achievement, and they provide some very substantial examples and studies that show that there is a strong socio-economic issue, as well as a strong issue around teacher status and society's attitudes towards education and towards the profession. So we have this bizarre situation where on the one hand the government's saying we need quality teachers and the best teachers, and then we have the proposal that some schools will only have a proportion of registered teachers. So there's a very double message coming out of the education policy at the moment. And recently the government hosted a gentleman called Andreas Schlecker, I think it is, from OECD, and I went along to his presentation, and one of the things he said was low-income United States students did far worse than high-income students, but poor kids in Finland and Canada do far better despite disadvantage. And according to PISA, that's because PISA, OECD people, the government hosted this gentleman, and he said this, because the focus is on equity, or the focus, I'm quoting him, his written statement, focuses on equity, or the focus is on the idea of competition and choice, which has failed. So we can either have a focus on high trust in teachers, a broad curriculum, quality teaching, and a goal of equity, which is certainly the model that the Finns are committed to, or a model that talks about choice and competition, which has actually failed. And it's interesting to see internationally that we're now, it's a little like New Zealand still trying to build motorways when everyone's trying to stop building motorways. We're now trying to introduce policies that other people are abandoning because choice has turned out to be no choice. It has failed the children who we most want to support, and we all agree those children need that support and deserve it. So even when a numbers guru who believes that education is some kind of mathematical formula has conceded that charter schools have not made a difference, but we carry on, Mr Chair, like lemmings to the cliff edge of choice, except it's our least advantaged children who we're chucking off the edge into the non-ambulance at the bottom, which used to be a second chance adult education before most of it was cut. And that's not a pretty sight. And today in the House we learned that charter schools, and otherwise known to some people as partnership schools, will have a, quote, significant percentage of registered teachers. But we don't know how many. 1 to 200 kids, 50% qualified, who knows? But we are relying on the idea that there's such a thing as a limited authority to teach. Now, the limited authority to teach was brought in for people who were going to transition into full registration. It wasn't brought in as a mechanism for getting rid of qualification and registration and teaching. I'm all for the idea of a limited authority to teach, and I'm all for the idea of bringing people into schools with different skills to support our children's learning in a variety of ways. But I don't believe, and neither does OECD, that you put the most vulnerable children in a situation where they do not have people with a pedagogical grasp. Because if you're going to look at who is missing out, if you're going to look at students with disabilities, for example, are you going to put people in front of them who have no pedagogical background about how learning works? These are critical educational questions, and they have to be evidence-based. We can't just randomly hope that some experiments that have failed elsewhere will randomly work better over here so long as we meet outcomes and contracts. Because the language of outcomes and contracts, the language of business, is not the language of educational success. And I think that's what the international work has shown, that we're actually heading in the wrong direction when we come down to who it is that's missing out. It's a fundamental question about disadvantage and about the idea of investing in children in terms of cultural inclusion, which is a big issue for this country, and equity and quality. So we need to invest in those programs, and some of them are costly, that are going to make change in schools. And that doesn't mean getting rid of registered teachers.
Mr Chair.
Sue Moroney.
Mr Chair, I'd like to take the opportunity to speak on the early childhood education part of